The story of the Habsburgs begins in a way that is not particularly dramatic, which is fitting, because most of what follows is long, administrative, and mildly exhausting. Somewhere around the 11th century, in what is now Switzerland, a family with a castle and reasonable ambitions began doing what many noble families did at the time: marrying well, collecting titles, and trying very hard not to lose what they already had. They were not especially glamorous at first. They did not conquer vast lands with swords blazing in the sun. Instead, they waited, they married, they inherited, then they married again. Over time, this proved to be an extremely effective strategy, if not a particularly exciting one. The Habsburg motto, whether officially stated or not, might as well have been, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." This approach allowed them to quietly accumulate territories across Europe without needing to constantly fight for them. Through carefully arranged marriages, they gained control over Austria, parts of Germany, Spain, the Low Countries, and eventually a collection of lands so scattered that even contemporary mapmakers probably sighed when asked to draw them. It was not elegant, it was not efficient, but it worked. As generations passed, the family grew in power and reputation. By the late Middle Ages and early modern period, the Habsburgs were no longer just another noble house. They were emperors, kings, archdukes, holders of titles that required long introductions and even longer documents. With power came responsibility, meetings, and an endless amount of ceremonial clothing. It also came with a growing problem that no one seemed eager to address. The family had begun marrying almost exclusively within itself. At first, this did not seem like a crisis. Royal families across Europe frequently married cousins. It kept land within the family and alliances neatly contained. The Habsburgs simply took this habit and committed to it with unusual dedication. Uncles married nieces, first cousins married first cousins, second cousins married first cousins again, just to be safe. Each marriage made sense politically. Each one slightly reduced the number of new genes entering the family. Over time, this decision accumulated consequences. One of the most visible results was the now famous Habsburg jaw. It was long, heavy, and increasingly difficult to ignore. Portraits from different centuries show the same expression repeating itself: a prominent lower lip, a stretched chin, and an air of quiet discomfort. Court painters did their best, but even they could not entirely smooth out what genetics had firmly decided. This jaw became less a family trait and more a family announcement. Beyond appearances, there were health problems. Many Habsburg children did not survive infancy. Those who did often struggled with chronic illnesses, physical weakness, or cognitive difficulties. Despite ruling vast territories, some emperors were barely capable of ruling themselves for more than a few hours a day. Still, the machinery of empire continued. Advisors governed, bureaucrats wrote, wars were declared and ended in the name of rulers who were sometimes too unwell to fully understand them. Perhaps the most extreme example was Charles II of Spain, a man so genetically compromised that even his contemporaries, who were accustomed to royal eccentricities, found his condition alarming. He struggled to speak clearly, could not chew properly, and was frequently ill. He was also, unfortunately for Spain, the final Habsburg king in that line. When he died without an heir, Europe promptly descended into a war over who should inherit the mess he left behind. Yet despite all this, the Habsburgs endured for centuries. They adapted, slowly and reluctantly, to changing times. Some branches faded. Others rebranded themselves as constitutional monarchs, ceremonial figures, or historical footnotes. The family that once ruled much of Europe eventually became something quieter, a reminder that power can last a long time, even when the foundation supporting it grows steadily weaker. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Habsburg era was effectively over. Empires collapsed, borders shifted, and crowns lost their practical meaning. What remained was a long, oddly intimate family history, one filled with marriages that were politically brilliant and biologically unfortunate. It is not a story of sudden downfall or dramatic endings. It is, instead, a slow lesson in what happens when a family rules the world but refuses to meet anyone new along the way. The inheritance problem left behind by Charles II did not just inconvenience Spain. It irritated nearly every major power in Europe, which is often how wars begin. The War of the Spanish Succession followed, lasting years, draining treasuries, and ending with treaties that everyone signed while quietly planning how to undo them later. The Habsburgs lost Spain but retained their core territories in Central Europe, which they continued to govern in the same careful, paperwork-heavy manner they always had. This was less a collapse than a slow rearranging of furniture. In Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, the family attempted something resembling reform. Emperors like Maria Theresa discovered that running an empire required more than inherited titles and elaborate family trees. Taxes had to be collected, armies had to be organized, schools had to exist. She ruled for decades, producing 16 children along the way, several of whom were promptly married off to reinforce alliances that were already fraying. This was progress, but still very much the Habsburg version of it. By the 18th century, Europe itself was changing. Enlightenment ideas began circulating, suggesting that perhaps rulers should be competent, governments rational, and laws applied with some consistency. The Habsburgs listened politely and adopted a few ideas that did not threaten their position too directly. Serfdom was adjusted rather than abolished. Censorship was relaxed slightly, then tightened again when people used it too enthusiastically. Reform happened, but always at a pace slow enough to allow everyone involved to sit down between decisions. The family's genetic issues did not vanish overnight, but they became less visible as marriages gradually expanded beyond the tightest inner circles. This was less a moral awakening and more a practical necessity. The empire needed heirs who could survive childhood and occasionally attend meetings without assistance. Even so, the reputation remained. The Habsburg jaw had already done its work. It lingered in caricatures, gossip, and the quiet assumptions of foreign courts. As the 19th century arrived, nationalism began pressing against the edges of the empire. The Habsburg lands were a patchwork of languages, cultures, and identities held together by tradition, bureaucracy, and the occasional military reminder. Hungarians wanted autonomy, Czechs wanted recognition, Italians wanted out. The empire responded with committees, compromises, and carefully worded decrees that solved problems temporarily, while ensuring they would return later in a more complicated form. Franz Joseph I ruled for nearly 70 years, which sounds impressive until one realizes that much of that time was spent reacting to crises rather than preventing them. Revolutions flared in 1848. Wars were lost to Prussia and Italy. His personal life was marked by tragedy, including the death of his son and the assassination of his wife. Through it all, he continued working, attending audiences, signing documents, and maintaining the appearance of stability. This, more than charisma or vision, became the defining Habsburg trait. By the early 20th century, the empire was tired. It still functioned, but only just. Administration had become an art form practiced by specialists who knew which forms to file and which languages to avoid using in official settings. The ruling family remained dignified, distant, and increasingly irrelevant to the forces shaping the modern world. Industrialization, mass politics, and international alliances moved faster than ceremonial monarchies could comfortably follow. The final moment came, as it often does in European history, through an assassination. In 1914, the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a chain reaction that led to the First World War. The conflict shattered empires that had appeared immovable only years earlier. When the war ended, the Austro-Hungarian Empire quietly dissolved. There was no grand abdication scene filled with drama. There were announcements, train journeys, and a general understanding that the long Habsburg experiment was over. What remained afterward was memory. Palaces became museums, titles became historical curiosities. The family itself faded into private life, still noble in name, but no longer central to Europe's future. Their legacy is not one of sudden failure, but of remarkable endurance paired with equally remarkable stubbornness. The Habsburgs ruled by marrying, inheriting, and waiting, and for centuries, that was enough. Eventually, it wasn't. And the world, having waited a very long time, finally moved on. In the decades after the empire disappeared, the former Habsburg lands adjusted to life without an emperor who signed things in triplicate. New republics experimented with constitutions. Borders were redrawn with optimism, then redrawn again with regret. For the Habsburg family itself, this period involved packing, downsizing, and learning how to exist without a court schedule dictating when one woke up, ate, or smiled politely at ambassadors. It was a quiet transition, which suited them. Some members of the family attempted to stay relevant by speaking publicly about unity, tradition, and the general importance of continuity. Others chose a more practical approach and lived quietly, pursuing education, farming, or diplomatic careers that did not involve crowns. The habits of centuries do not vanish instantly, though. Even in private life, former archdukes tended to stand straight, speak carefully, and treat paperwork with the respect it deserved. Meanwhile, historians began doing what historians do best: sorting, categorizing, and arguing. The Habsburgs became a case study. They were analyzed for their political strategy, their administrative systems, and, inevitably, their genetics. Charts were drawn. Family trees were expanded until they resembled tangled shrubs. The phrase dynastic inbreeding became permanently attached to their name, ensuring that no discussion of their achievements could ever be entirely flattering. This focus on biology sometimes overshadowed the more mundane reality of how the empire actually functioned. For centuries, Habsburg rule was less about dramatic decisions and more about routine governance. Officials collected taxes, resolved disputes, and translated documents into languages most rulers never learned to speak fluently. It was an empire sustained by clerks, not charisma. This may explain why it lasted so long and collapsed so quietly. In popular culture, the family's image hardened into something almost cartoonish. Portraits of protruding jaws and tired eyes were reproduced endlessly, often without context. The idea of a royal house slowly marrying itself into weakness became a convenient moral lesson. Do not isolate, do not refuse change, and perhaps, occasionally, meet someone new. It was a neat story, even if reality was more complicated and considerably slower. In truth, the Habsburgs did adapt, just not quickly. They reformed laws, reorganized armies, and embraced modern administration when absolutely necessary. They were rarely innovators, but they were persistent. This persistence allowed them to survive religious wars, peasant revolts, and the steady erosion of absolute monarchy. It could not, however, protect them from a century that valued mass politics and industrial power over inherited legitimacy. By the mid-23rd century, Europe had little patience left for dynasties defined by ancestry rather than ability. The old symbols remained palaces, uniforms, ceremonial language, but they were increasingly decorative. The Habsburg name became something you encountered in textbooks, museum placards, and the occasional long street name that no one shortened out of respect. Today, the family exists mostly as a historical reference point. Their former territories are independent nations with their own identities, histories, and complicated relationships with the past. Tourists walk through former imperial residences, admire the furniture, and move on. The empire that once stretched across Europe has been reduced to guided tours and gift shops. And yet, there is something oddly impressive about how long it all lasted. Through marriages that narrowed bloodlines, through rulers who struggled to rule, through centuries of gradual strain, the system held. Not brilliantly, not gracefully, but consistently. The Habsburg story is not about sudden catastrophe or dramatic villainy. It is about accumulation of land, of titles, of habits, and eventually, of problems. If there is a lesson here, it arrives quietly, without insisting on being noticed. Power maintained through tradition alone grows fragile over time. Systems that refuse renewal eventually exhaust themselves. And families, no matter how royal, are still subject to the same limitations as everyone else. The Habsburgs simply demonstrated this on a continental scale. So as this long, winding dynasty fades back into history, it does so without fireworks. There is no final twist, no shocking revelation waiting at the end. Just centuries of rule, followed by a gentle conclusion. A family that once governed Europe now governs a few pages in history books. And for a story that lasted so long, that feels like a suitably quiet ending. With time, even the memory of constant rule begins to soften. The Habsburgs, once omnipresent in European politics, slowly became something distant and abstract. Their name stopped appearing in headlines and started appearing in footnotes. Students encountered them briefly, usually between exams, memorizing dates, marriages, and wars, before quietly forgetting most of it. This, too, is a kind of ending. What remains most striking is how ordinary much of their daily life actually was, despite the crowns and palaces. Behind the formal portraits were people dealing with schedules, illnesses, dull meetings, and family expectations that never quite relaxed. A Habsburg birth was not simply a celebration, it was a strategic event. Childhood was monitored, education was controlled, marriage was negotiated, long before affection had any chance to appear. Sleep, one imagines, was not always easy. The weight of legacy pressed heavily on each generation. To be born into the family was to inherit centuries of decisions already made on one's behalf. You did not choose where you would rule, whom you would marry, or how your life would be remembered. You simply continued. This sense of continuation, more than ambition or cruelty, defined the dynasty. They did not rule because they were exceptional. They ruled because they were already there. This may explain why decline came not as a collapse, but as a gradual thinning. Authority eroded slowly, like stone worn smooth by repeated handling. Each reform diluted absolute power slightly. Each concession acknowledged that the world outside the palace gates was changing. By the time the family realized how far things had shifted, there was little left to hold onto besides ceremony. Even the famous jaw, so often treated as a symbol of arrogance or decay, was less a mark of evil than of routine. It was the physical record of decisions made calmly, rationally, and repeatedly over generations. No single marriage caused it. No single ruler chose it. It emerged quietly, as outcomes often do when no one pauses long enough to reconsider direction. There is something deeply human in that. Systems persist because they are familiar. Families repeat patterns because they work until they don't. The Habsburgs were not uniquely blind. They were simply very consistent. And consistency, when paired with immense power, can shape continents. In modern discussions, it is tempting to reduce their history to a cautionary tale. Inbreeding leads to decline. Empires fall. Time moves on. These statements are true, but incomplete. What the Habsburg story really shows is how long a system can function while slowly undermining itself. Centuries passed between early warning signs and final dissolution. Generations lived full lives within a structure already bending under its own weight. For the people who lived under Habsburg rule, life rarely felt dramatic. Taxes were collected, crops were harvested, laws changed slowly, if at all. The emperor's face on a coin mattered less than the weather. History, as experienced by most people, is not a sequence of turning points. It is routine, interrupted occasionally by inconvenience. And so, as the story drifts toward rest, the Habsburgs settle into their final role. Not rulers, not villains, not even particularly mysterious figures. Just an example of how power behaves when left largely unquestioned for a very long time. Their empire expanded through patience, endured through habit, and ended through exhaustion. If you listen closely to their history, it does not shout, it hums. A low, steady sound of documents being signed, marriages being arranged, borders being adjusted, and generations quietly replacing one another. It is the sound of continuity, neither comforting nor threatening, just persistent. And perhaps that is why the story works so well for sleep. There are no sharp turns, no sudden revelations, only a slow accumulation of choices, repeated until their consequences could no longer be ignored. A dynasty that ruled much of Europe, not through brilliance or terror, but through the simple act of continuing. Eventually, continuation itself became impossible. The world grew louder, faster, less patient, and the Habsburgs, having waited for centuries, finally faded into the background where long stories go when they are finished. Nothing exploded, nothing snapped, the lights simply dimmed, and history, as it always does, moved on quietly. After that, silence settles in. Not an absolute silence, of course, but the kind that follows when a long-running system finally stops producing noise. The Habsburg name remains, but it no longer carries instructions. It does not summon armies or approve budgets. It does not require anyone to bow. It simply exists, detached from function, like a label on an old drawer whose contents have already been emptied. For historians, this quiet is useful. It allows distance. With distance comes analysis, and with analysis comes a calmer understanding of what the dynasty actually was. Not monsters, not geniuses, not a single, unified force, moving with purpose. Just a family that discovered a method for staying in place and used it repeatedly, long after the surrounding conditions had changed. If you trace their story from beginning to end, there is no moment where someone clearly should have stopped everything and said, "This is no longer working." Each generation inherited a system that still functioned well enough. Taxes arrived, borders held, titles were recognized, problems were manageable, at least for now. And "for now" is often enough to postpone serious decisions indefinitely. Daily life within the imperial household remained structured even as relevance faded. Meals followed schedules, ceremonies were observed, letters were written with careful phrasing, even exile came with etiquette. The habits of governance proved more durable than governance itself. This, perhaps, is the most telling legacy of the Habsburgs: form outlasting substance. Outside palace walls, the world moved forward without waiting. New political ideas emphasized participation rather than inheritance. Economies shifted toward industry and finance. Power flowed through factories, parliaments, and alliances, rather than bloodlines. The old imperial model did not fail because it was attacked directly. It failed because fewer people found it necessary. In the end, the dynasty did not fall so much as thin out. Authority leaked away piece by piece. First influence, then territory, then relevance. What remained was memory carefully preserved, often simplified, occasionally exaggerated. The jaw became a symbol because symbols are easier than explanations. A single face can represent centuries more comfortably than ledgers and treaties. But even that symbol grows faint over time. New generations recognize the name without emotion. It is something learned, not felt, a historical texture rather than a presence. The Habsburgs become one dynasty among many, notable mainly for how long they lasted and how little noise they made while doing so. There is something almost reassuring about that. History often focuses on collapse, violence, and spectacle. The Habsburg story reminds us that most power fades differently. It erodes, it tires, it becomes irrelevant before it becomes impossible. And those who live inside it rarely notice the moment when permanence quietly ends. For the individuals born into the family after the empire's fall, the weight of history became lighter but never vanished entirely. They carried a name with echoes, attached to expectations that no longer had a clear destination. Identity without purpose can be an uncomfortable inheritance. Still, it is easier than empire. Looking back, it becomes clear that the dynasty's greatest strength and greatest weakness were the same thing: continuity. The ability to repeat what worked, calmly and patiently, without much reflection. For centuries, this produced stability. Eventually, it produced stagnation. Neither outcome was sudden. Both unfolded at a pace slow enough to feel normal. And so the Habsburgs rest now, where long institutions usually rest: in archives, in museums, in guided explanations, delivered at an even pace. Their story does not demand attention. It does not insist on relevance. It simply waits to be noticed if someone happens to be looking, which is perhaps the most fitting conclusion. A dynasty built on waiting ends by being waited upon. Its noise replaced by quiet observation. Its authority replaced by curiosity. A family that once ruled continents now occupies shelves. And in that stillness, there is no judgment, only sequence. One thing followed another, until it didn't. A very long story, told slowly, ending without urgency. Just a soft pause. Then nothing more. By this point, even the echoes have grown tired. The grand narrative has settled into something softer, less concerned with conclusions, and more comfortable with lingering. The Habsburgs no longer invite analysis so much as reflection. Their story becomes background noise in the long hallway of European history, audible but unobtrusive, like distant footsteps that never quite arrive. What is left, when all the crowns and councils are removed, is a pattern. A family that believed deeply in continuity created a world designed to preserve itself. That world required repetition, caution, and an almost ritualistic respect for precedent. Change was allowed, but only when carefully justified and politely delayed. For a very long time, this approach felt sensible. Stability, after all, is often mistaken for permanence. Within the empire, generations lived their entire lives without seeing dramatic shifts in leadership. The emperor was simply there, as expected as seasons or taxes. This constancy shaped behavior. People adapted to slow administration and layered authority. Complaints moved upward through channels that took years to respond, if they responded at all. Urgency was rare. Patience was mandatory. Inside the ruling family, patience was cultivated early. Children were raised to understand duty before desire. Personal ambition mattered less than maintaining balance. Emotional restraint was praised. Public composure was essential. Even grief followed protocol. This was not cruelty so much as training. To function within the system, one learned to become part of it. Over time, this training produced rulers who were competent caretakers rather than visionaries. They maintained what existed rather than imagining what might come next. In calm periods, this worked well. In moments of rapid change, it left the empire slightly behind, always adjusting to yesterday's problem, while tomorrow quietly arrived. The Habsburgs rarely sought to reinvent themselves. Reinvention implies dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction implies risk. Instead, they refined. Procedures became more precise. Titles became more elaborate. Ceremonies became more codified. The appearance of order deepened even as the underlying structures grew fragile. From the outside, the empire still looked solid. From within, it felt increasingly procedural. This may be why its end felt anticlimactic. There was no final, defining failure, no single decision that doomed everything, just a gradual realization, shared unevenly, that the system no longer fit the world around it. By the time this became obvious, adaptation would have required abandoning the very habits that had sustained the dynasty for centuries. For those who study the Habsburgs now, the temptation is to search for lessons. Genetics, governance, tradition, reform. All of these matter. But perhaps the most subtle lesson lies in pace. Change rarely announces itself loudly. It accumulates quietly, waiting for institutions to notice. Those built to endure sometimes notice last. As the story continues to soften, details blur, dates become approximate, names repeat until they lose distinction. The dynasty's narrative compresses into themes rather than events. Marriage, inheritance, administration, decline. The specifics matter less than the rhythm. That rhythm is steady, almost soothing. It lacks the sharp turns that keep one alert. Instead, it invites drifting. One ruler replaces another. One treaty follows the last. One generation grows accustomed to conditions that will not last. The repetition itself becomes the story. And so, when thinking of the Habsburgs, it is useful to set aside drama. There is none waiting at the end. Their history does not reward anticipation. It rewards endurance, the ability to sit with long stretches of continuity and accept that most of history feels this way while it is happening. Eventually, even endurance has limits, not because it fails, but because the environment changes faster than habit can adjust. When that happens, systems do not shatter. They thin. They recede. They become optional. The Habsburgs did not disappear. They simply stopped being necessary. Today, their legacy survives in architecture, in administrative traditions, in borders shaped by decisions made slowly and carefully over centuries. It survives in the idea that power can be maintained without spectacle, through patience and routine. It also survives as a reminder that patience alone cannot sustain relevance forever. As this final stretch of the story settles, there is no need to rush toward a conclusion. The conclusion has already arrived, quietly, some time ago. What remains is the long afterimage of a dynasty that believed deeply in continuity and proved, through its own history, both the strength and the cost of that belief. The sound fades. The pace slows further. Nothing new enters. Nothing demands attention. And in that calm, the story rests. Still, unfinished, perhaps, but no longer moving. At a certain point, even reflection begins to feel unnecessary. The story has said what it needed to say, repeatedly, across centuries. The Habsburgs did not leave behind a mystery to solve so much as a surface to observe. The longer one looks, the more familiar it becomes. Patterns repeat. Outcomes align. Surprise fades. If you imagine the empire at its height, it is less a dramatic panorama and more a collection of offices, rooms with heavy desks, shelves of bound volumes, officials speaking quietly in measured tones, decisions made incrementally, approved cautiously, and recorded carefully for future reference. This is not the image that usually appears in textbooks, but it is closer to how power actually operated day to day. For the people living under Habsburg rule, the dynasty was rarely a personal presence. Most never saw an emperor. They interacted instead with local administrators, tax collectors, and magistrates who represented authority in its most practical form. Empire, as experienced on the ground, was routine. Laws were enforced. Disputes were settled. Life continued. This distance between ruler and subject contributed to the dynasty's longevity. Emotional attachment was limited. Loyalty was procedural rather than passionate. When the system finally dissolved, many people adapted quickly because daily life had never depended strongly on the personality at the top. The structure mattered more than the name attached to it. Within the family itself, identity was shaped by expectations rather than freedom. A Habsburg did not need to ask who they were. The answer was already prepared. One belonged to the dynasty, and that belonging defined education, marriage, and conduct. Personal preference had little room to develop, but neither did uncertainty. The path was clear, even if it was narrow. Over generations, this clarity produced a kind of calm acceptance. You did what was required. You fulfilled your role. You passed responsibility onward. The system did not encourage questioning, but it did provide stability. For a long time, that stability felt sufficient. As the modern world accelerated, however, sufficiency lost its appeal. Faster communication, mass politics, and economic change rewarded flexibility over consistency. Institutions that thrived on slow adjustment struggled to keep pace. The Habsburgs, having mastered continuity, found themselves slightly out of step with urgency. This misalignment was subtle. There was no single moment of realization. Instead, relevance slipped quietly. Decisions mattered less. Authority carried less weight. Eventually, the dynasty occupied space without shaping it, presence without influence, history without direction. When historians describe this process, they often search for turning points: wars, assassinations, treaties. These are useful markers, but they do not capture the lived experience of decline. Decline feels like routine continuing without purpose, like habits maintained after they stop serving a function, like forms filled out for outcomes that no longer matter. The Habsburgs reached this state slowly. By the time the empire formally ended, much of its authority had already dissolved in practice. The final announcements merely confirmed what had been happening quietly for years. The system stopped not because it was destroyed, but because it was no longer needed. In the long view, this is neither tragic nor ironic. It is ordinary. Most institutions end this way. They outlast their usefulness, persist through habit, and fade when alternatives become easier. The Habsburgs are notable only because of the scale on which this occurred. Now, when their name appears, it does so without urgency. It carries associations rather than power, a style of governance, a method of inheritance, a particular rhythm of rule. These things can be studied, admired, or criticized, but they no longer demand response. And so the story settles into its final state, not closed, exactly, but inactive, available for reference, quietly complete. There is nothing left to resolve, no tension waiting to break. The long arc has reached rest, not through impact, but through stillness. The documents remain, the buildings stand, the names endure, but the motion is gone. And in that absence of motion, there is calm. The kind that arrives after a very long process finishes doing what it was designed to do. No announcement, no echo, just time continuing, gently, without it. Eventually, even the act of remembering becomes optional. The Habsburgs no longer require explanation unless someone asks, and fewer people do. Their story has settled into the background layer of history, present but unobtrusive, like an old foundation stone beneath a newer building. It supports understanding, but it does not draw attention to itself. What endures most clearly is not a sequence of events, but a temperament, a way of approaching power that favored patience over speed, inheritance over innovation, and maintenance over transformation. For centuries, this temperament shaped decisions that affected millions of lives, most of whom never heard the reasoning behind them. They simply lived within the results. In this sense, the dynasty functioned less like a family and more like a system. Individuals entered it, performed their roles, and exited. Personal qualities mattered, but only within narrow limits. Exceptional talent was useful. Serious weakness could be managed. What mattered most was continuity. As long as the line continued, the system held. This system did not demand brilliance. It demanded reliability. Appear on time, follow protocol, preserve alliances, produce heirs, sign documents, attend ceremonies, repeat. Over generations, repetition became second nature. The dynasty learned how to endure almost by reflex. But reflexes are slow to change. When circumstances shifted rapidly, the old responses lagged. The world outside the palace gates began operating on different assumptions. Authority became negotiable. Identity became political. Time itself seemed to move faster. The Habsburg method, refined for gradual change, struggled to adapt. Still, there was no panic. The system had never relied on urgency. Even as influence declined, form was preserved. Appearances remained dignified. Language remained formal. The rituals continued. In some ways, the dynasty was at its most consistent, just as it became least relevant. This consistency is what makes the story feel so even. There are no sharp emotional peaks, no sudden reversals, just a long, measured sequence of adjustments that never quite add up to transformation. For those expecting drama, the Habsburgs disappoint. For those interested in endurance, they are unmatched. In the modern imagination, they often appear frozen in portraits, wearing elaborate clothing and fixed expressions. These images reinforce the idea of stillness, but behind them was constant motion of a quieter kind, paperwork circulating, decisions deferred, compromises negotiated. An empire maintained not through force alone, but through administrative persistence. As centuries passed, the distance between image and function widened. The symbols remained powerful long after their practical effect diminished. Crowns still glittered. Titles still commanded respect. Yet the ability to shape outcomes increasingly depended on factors the dynasty did not control: industry, public opinion, international systems that operated beyond dynastic logic. When the final dismantling came, it followed the same pattern as everything else in the Habsburg story. Slowly, officially, without spectacle. There were decrees, departures, and adjustments. Life continued. The world did not pause to mark the moment. Most people were already focused on what came next. And perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand the end, not as a fall, but as a handover to time. The dynasty stepped aside not because it was pushed, but because it was no longer positioned to lead. History did not reject it. History simply continued in a different direction. Now, when one revisits the Habsburgs, it is usually in quiet spaces, libraries, museums, documentaries, spoken in calm voices. The tone feels appropriate. Their story does not benefit from excitement. It benefits from patience. There is something restful about tracing such a long, steady arc. A reminder that much of history unfolds without urgency, that systems rise and decline through accumulation rather than explosion. That power, when sustained long enough, eventually becomes background. And so the narrative settles again, with nothing new to add. The dynasty has completed its function. Its lessons are available, but not insisted upon. Its presence remains, but only as context. The movement has stopped. The pattern is complete. What follows is simply time, doing what it always does. Slowly, quietly, without asking anyone's permission. At this final stretch, even the idea of continuation feels unnecessary. The story has already done its work. There is nothing left to introduce, no new angle waiting patiently off stage. The Habsburgs have become part of the historical atmosphere, not a subject demanding focus, but a presence that explains why certain things look the way they do. If one were to walk through Europe today, the legacy appears indirectly. Administrative borders that seem oddly shaped, palaces built on a scale no longer required, laws and procedures that feel older than the nations enforcing them. These are not monuments in the dramatic sense. They are leftovers, functional at one point, gradually repurposed. For the people who once lived under the empire, change arrived unevenly. Some noticed immediately, others barely at all. Life after the Habsburgs did not transform overnight. Crops still needed harvesting, shops still opened. Bureaucracy, if anything, became more familiar rather than less. This continuity softened the ending. Empires rarely end the way stories suggest they should. Within the former ruling family, memory became personal rather than political. Stories were passed down without urgency. Titles were remembered without authority. The weight of expectation lifted slowly, replaced by a quieter question of identity. Who are you when history no longer needs you to be anything in particular? That question has no dramatic answer. It resolves the way most things do, gradually, privately, without witnesses. The descendants adapted, as people always do. Some leaned into the past. Others moved deliberately away from it. Most simply lived ordinary lives shaped by an extraordinary surname that mattered less with each passing year. From a distance, the entire dynasty compresses into a single impression: long, steady, restrained. A ruling house that rarely rushed, rarely panicked, and rarely reinvented itself. For centuries, this approach sustained power. Eventually, it sustained only memory. There is no moral delivered at the end, no warning spoken aloud. History does not explain itself so neatly. If anything, the Habsburgs demonstrate how easily a system can feel permanent while quietly becoming optional, how continuity can blur into inertia, how endurance can delay, but not prevent, irrelevance. As this account settles into stillness, it mirrors its subject. No flourish, no final declaration, just a gradual easing of attention, as if the mind itself has decided there is nothing left to monitor. The names remain on pages. The buildings remain on streets. The influence remains embedded in structures no longer questioned. But the motion, the need to follow what happens next, is gone. And that is enough. The long line has ended not with a sound, but with absence, with the gentle realization that the story has already concluded, and we are simply sitting with the quiet afterward. Nothing presses forward. Nothing asks to be remembered urgently. The past rests, and the present, unconcerned, continues. Slowly, softly, on its own. At this point, even the quiet feels settled, the kind of quiet that does not invite further thought, only acceptance. The Habsburgs have reached that stage of history where nothing new attaches itself to the name. No fresh debates, no rediscoveries that change the outline, just a long, finished shape resting where it has always been. If one listens carefully to the way their story is usually told now, it has slowed down. Sentences stretch, explanations soften, the urgency drains away. This is not because the events were unimportant, but because importance fades once it no longer affects tomorrow. History, once complete, becomes descriptive rather than demanding. What remains most clearly is the sense of duration. Few families, institutions, or ideas persist for so long without interruption. The Habsburgs did not survive by brilliance or cruelty alone. They survived by being consistent when others were impulsive, by waiting when others rushed, by marrying when others fought. It was a strategy suited to a world that moved slowly. When that world accelerated, the strategy did not break. It simply became less useful, like a tool designed for careful craftsmanship in an age of mass production. Still well-made, still functional, just no longer central. For centuries, power flowed through the family almost automatically. A birth occurred, a title transferred, a document was signed. The machinery resumed its rhythm. Individuals came and went, but the structure barely noticed. That kind of system does not end dramatically. It winds down. And winding down takes time. It feels gradual from the inside, barely perceptible day to day, only obvious in hindsight, when the long line of continuation finally stops extending forward. This is why the end feels so quiet. No one moment demands attention. No final ruler embodies collapse. No single decision carries blame. The system simply reaches the edge of relevance and pauses there, unsure how to proceed, until proceeding is no longer expected. In that pause, history steps in and gently closes the chapter. Not by force, by omission. The story is no longer added to, it becomes complete. And completeness has a particular calm to it. Nothing remains unresolved. Nothing is waiting. The narrative has used all the space it needs. So, the Habsburgs remain where finished stories remain. Accessible, but undemanding. Significant, but not insistent. A reminder that power can last a very long time without ever feeling dramatic, and that endings do not always announce themselves. They simply arrive, unnoticed, while attention drifts elsewhere. The desks are cleared, the files are archived, the corridors echo briefly, then not at all. and the dynasty, having occupied centuries, now occupies memory alone, which is quiet enough and slow enough to rest. By now, the rhythm has settled into something almost weightless. The story no longer advances so much as it lingers, existing without effort. The Habsburgs have crossed fully into that category of history that does not require motion to remain present. Their influence is fixed, like an old watermark beneath the surface of Europe, visible only when the light hits it just right. What is remarkable, when looked at without urgency, is how little of their rule depended on moments of inspiration. There were no sudden visions that reshaped the world overnight, no sweeping reinventions announced with confidence. Instead, there was preference for the known, the acceptable, the inherited. Decisions were shaped by precedent more than imagination, and for a long time, this felt not only reasonable but wise. That wisdom, however, belonged to a slower world, a world where news traveled at the pace of a horse, where authority was rarely questioned publicly, and where stability itself was a primary political value. In such conditions, the Habsburg approach worked. It produced order. It reduced chaos. It allowed people to plan their lives with some expectation that tomorrow would resemble today. Over centuries, this expectation became a habit. People grew used to the idea that certain things simply did not change. Borders shifted occasionally, but the structure remained. Titles evolved, but the family endured. The empire felt less like a project and more like a condition of life. One did not support it or oppose it consciously. One lived within it. This may be why its disappearance felt oddly gentle. When the empire ended, there was no universal sense of loss or relief. Mostly, there was adjustment. Paperwork changed. Flags were replaced. Officials learned new titles. The machinery of daily life continued, now under different names. History turned the page without pausing for reaction. For the Habsburgs themselves, the transition from rulers to remnants required a different kind of patience. They had been trained to embody continuity. Now continuity no longer required them. The roles they had rehearsed for generations had quietly expired. What remained was identity without instruction. Some adapted by becoming custodians of memory. Others sought anonymity. Many lived somewhere in between, aware of their history but no longer defined by it. The name carried weight, but it no longer opened doors automatically. This, too, was an adjustment made slowly. From a distance, the dynasty's defining feature becomes clarity of pattern, marriage as policy, inheritance as strategy, administration as glue. Even decline followed this pattern, arriving not as rupture but as routine extended beyond usefulness. The system continued doing what it had always done until the environment no longer responded. There is a certain calm in recognizing this. History does not always end with conflict. Often, it ends with misalignment. Institutions remain functional, but not essential. Authority persists, but not decisively. Influence fades, not because it is resisted, but because it is bypassed. The Habsburgs exemplify this kind of ending. They were not overthrown in a singular moment. They were outpaced. The world reorganized itself around principles that no longer required dynastic continuity. Efficiency replaced lineage. Participation replaced inheritance. Speed replaced patience. Yet none of this erases what came before. The long centuries of rule still shape the present in subtle ways. Administrative habits linger. Cultural boundaries echo old arrangements. Even the idea of a multi-ethnic Europe owes something to an empire that attempted, imperfectly, to hold diversity together through bureaucracy rather than ideology. As the narrative reaches its quietest point, it offers no final argument, only an observation that endurance can be achieved without brilliance, that power can persist through routine, and that systems designed for continuity must eventually confront a world that values change. There is no need to rush away from this realization. Like the story itself, it unfolds slowly. The Habsburgs did not hurry into relevance, and they did not hurry out of it. They waited, and in waiting, they shaped centuries. Now, there is nothing left to wait for. The waiting has finished. The story does not end with a sentence demanding closure. It ends the way long processes end, with stillness, with acceptance, with the understanding that nothing further is required. The name remains, settled into history. The noise has long since faded. What lingers is a calm awareness of something completed. And in that calm, the story rests, unmoving, complete, quiet enough to let the mind drift elsewhere. And finally, sleep. There is a point, late in long histories, where even analysis grows tired. The facts have been arranged, the interpretations have settled, nothing new insists on being said. The Habsburgs reach that point gently, without resistance, as if they were always prepared for it. If their story teaches anything, it does so without raising its voice. It suggests that power does not need intensity to last, only structure. That influence can be sustained through habit rather than inspiration. And that habit, repeated long enough, can feel indistinguishable from permanence. For centuries, the dynasty relied on the quiet confidence that tomorrow would resemble today. This confidence shaped everything. Decisions favored caution. Innovations were introduced slowly, only when unavoidable. Risk was managed by postponement. And for a remarkable length of time, this worked. The world rewarded patience because the world itself moved patiently. But time is not loyal to systems that assume its cooperation. Gradually, almost politely, it changed pace. Communication accelerated. Economies expanded. Politics shifted from inheritance to participation. None of this required a confrontation with the old order. It simply reduced its usefulness. The Habsburgs did not misunderstand this immediately. From within the system, everything still appeared intact. Ceremonies were observed, titles were recognized, bureaucracy functioned. The signs of decline were not dramatic failures, but subtle irrelevancies. Decisions that arrived too late, authority that required explanation, traditions that felt heavier than necessary. These signals are easy to miss when you are accustomed to continuity. When your entire history is defined by endurance, change does not announce itself as a threat. It arrives as inconvenience. And inconvenience, unlike crisis, can be tolerated indefinitely. This tolerance is perhaps the dynasty's most distinctive trait. They tolerated genetic narrowing because it preserved territory. They tolerated administrative complexity because it preserved balance. They tolerated stagnation because it preserved form. Each choice made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a system remarkably resistant to disruption and remarkably slow to adapt. When adaptation finally became unavoidable, it required abandoning the very habits that had sustained the dynasty. That was never likely to happen quickly. So instead, the system eased out of relevance. It remained visible but inactive, present but no longer decisive. The end, when it came, did not feel like an ending to those living through it. It felt like a reclassification. What had once been central became historical. What had been automatic became optional. Authority shifted elsewhere without ceremony. This is why the Habsburgs are remembered less for how they fell than for how long they stayed. Their decline lacks spectacle. It offers no cathartic moment. Instead, it demonstrates a quieter truth, that systems rarely collapse under pressure alone. More often, they fade when the environment stops responding. Now, centuries later, their presence is ambient. It exists in archives and architecture, in borders drawn carefully, then adjusted, reluctantly, in the administrative instincts of regions that once learned to live with layered authority. The empire is gone, but its habits remain faintly legible. There is something restful about this kind of legacy. It does not demand admiration or condemnation. It simply occupies space, calmly, waiting to be noticed or ignored. The Habsburgs do not argue for their importance. They assume it, the way they always did, and let time decide. And time has decided, not harshly, not decisively, just conclusively. The story has reached equilibrium. Nothing more accumulates. Nothing needs to be resolved. The long experiment in dynastic patience has completed its cycle. So, the narrative slows one last time, not because it must, but because there is no reason to hurry. Everything that needed to happen already has. The world moved on. The dynasty remained behind, intact but inactive. There is no tension left to hold, no question waiting at the end. Only the quiet recognition that something vast once existed, functioned exactly as designed, and then stopped being necessary. That recognition does not ask for reaction. It invites rest. The names stay where they are. The pages close themselves. And the long, careful story, having finally finished continuing, settles into silence. Not empty silence, finished silence. The kind that arrives after centuries of repetition, when nothing further needs to be done. And nothing more is expected. What follows that finished silence is not absence, but maintenance. History does not erase what it no longer needs. It stores it carefully. The Habsburgs are stored now, catalogued, contextualized, referenced when useful. Their presence has been flattened into background knowledge, which is perhaps the most complete form of rest a dynasty can achieve. When people encounter the name today, it arrives without urgency. It does not signal power or threat. It signals explanation. Why a palace is there, why a border bends, why an archive contains documents in several languages at once. The dynasty has become infrastructure for understanding, rather than a force to be reckoned with. This transformation is quiet, but thorough. Once, the Habsburgs were the reason decisions were made. Now they are the reason decisions once looked the way they did. Cause has turned into context. Authority into annotation. Even their most famous features, the jaw, the marriages, the improbable persistence, have softened into symbols rather than accusations. They are discussed with distance, often with a faint sense of inevitability. Not, how could this happen? But, of course, this happened. Long systems tend to produce long consequences. What is striking is how little emotion remains attached to it all. There is no widespread resentment, no longing for restoration. The dynasty has not become a rallying point or a warning shouted aloud. It has become an example studied calmly, usually while seated. This calm reflects the way the empire functioned at its core. The Habsburgs were never masters of spectacle. Their strength lay in normalization. Over time, extraordinary authority became ordinary presence. Rule felt administrative rather than personal. That is why its removal felt administrative too. The machinery stopped, but nothing exploded. In many places, the end of empire arrived as a series of notices. New letterheads, new legal language, new flags. The people doing the work remained the same. The buildings remained, the habits remained. Only the justification shifted. And that shift did not demand drama, it demanded adjustment. This is an uncomfortable truth for stories that prefer climaxes. But it is faithful to how institutions actually end. They do not fall from cliffs. They slow until they are overtaken. They persist until they are replaced. They become optional. The Habsburgs were replaced not by enemies alone, but by alternatives, national identities, modern administrations, systems that promised faster responses and clearer accountability. Whether those promises were fulfilled is another story, and not one that requires the Habsburgs to answer for it. Their role was already complete. For those who inherited the name without the empire, life became simpler and more complicated at once. Simpler because expectations were fewer. More complicated because identity no longer came with a function. One had to choose a life rather than continue one. This, too, happened quietly. Former royals became private citizens with unusual family histories. Some spoke about the past. Others avoided it. Most learned to carry it lightly. History is easier to manage when it no longer manages you. From a distance, the dynasty resembles a long sentence that ends without punctuation. No exclamation point, no question mark, just a gradual tapering until the words stop arriving. The meaning remains, but the motion has ceased. And perhaps that is the most fitting metaphor. The Habsburgs did not conclude. They tapered. Their influence narrowed, thinned, and settled into stillness. Nothing was broken. Nothing was resolved dramatically. The line simply stopped extending. So now, when the story is told for sleep, it works because it mirrors sleep itself. No sudden turn, no revelation, just a gentle lowering of intensity until awareness loosens its grip. The dynasty that once structured Europe now structures a few calm narratives. It holds attention briefly, then releases it. That is its final function. There is no need to remember every name, no need to track every marriage. The pattern is enough. Continuity, sustained too long, becomes weight. Weight, left unadjusted, becomes stillness. The Habsburgs reached stillness, and in that stillness, nothing demands response. The story has done all it can do. The rest belongs to time, and time, as always, proceeds quietly. At the very end of such long histories, there is often a moment where the mind stops trying to hold onto detail. Names blur together, dates soften. What remains is not information, but atmosphere. The Habsburgs, after all this time, exist mostly as atmosphere. Their story no longer needs precision to function. You do not need to remember which archduke ruled when, or which marriage connected which territory. The essence is enough. A family that trusted continuity more than change. A system that preferred inheritance to interruption. An empire that believed tomorrow would look much like today, and for a long while was correct. When people speak of them now, they rarely speak with urgency. There is no need. The consequences have already unfolded. The lessons, if there are any, sit quietly on the surface, available but not demanding attention. You can notice them, or not. Either way, history continues without comment. This is perhaps why the Habsburgs lend themselves so well to slow retelling. Their power did not arrive suddenly, and it did not leave abruptly. It accumulated, and then it dispersed. Like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, it changed the shape of the landscape without ever making much noise. Imagine the final years of imperial administration, clerks arriving to offices that would soon belong to someone else, forms stamped with symbols that would shortly be retired, language carefully maintained, even as its authority thinned. There is no panic in this image, just routine carried slightly past its expiration date. Most people living through it did not experience a dramatic ending. They experienced updates, new governments, new requirements, new ways of describing familiar realities. Life did not pause to acknowledge the conclusion of a dynasty. It simply adjusted its paperwork. And the former rulers adjusted too. The habits of deference faded. The automatic authority disappeared. What remained was memory, private and public, slowly separating from daily life. For the first time in centuries, the family name existed without function. That, in itself, was a quiet transformation. From the outside, the entire arc appears smooth, but from the inside, it was likely barely noticeable. This is how most long processes end. They do not announce themselves. They complete themselves while attention is elsewhere. Looking back now, the Habsburgs seem less like protagonists and more like a background mechanism. They provided structure, they maintained balance, they absorbed strain slowly, and when they were no longer suited to the pace of the world, they stopped shaping it. There is no moral that needs repeating, no warning that must be emphasized. The story does not insist on being learned from. It simply exists, fully formed, available to be revisited when calm explanation is needed. And perhaps that is the final quality worth noting. The dynasty never demanded emotional engagement. It required compliance, not passion. It governed through presence rather than persuasion. Even its end followed this pattern. It did not provoke outrage or grief. It allowed itself to be replaced. Now, centuries later, the name survives without pressure. It does not compete with the present. It does not ask to return. It rests where finished things rest, preserved but inactive. When the lights go out in museums, nothing stirs. When archives close for the night, nothing insists on being reopened. The story remains exactly where it is, unchanged by silence. That is the final state of long continuity, not disappearance, but stillness, not forgetting, but rest. And so the history of the Habsburgs concludes in the only way it ever could have, slowly, without interruption, without spectacle, just a long sequence of moments, now complete. Nothing further follows. The mind loosens its hold, the details fade, the pattern remains, and the story, having finished continuing, allows itself to be quiet, enough to sleep. And with that, the remaining edges smooth themselves out. There is no corner left to examine, no loose thread asking to be pulled. The Habsburgs have reached the kind of historical completeness where even curiosity slows down. The story does not resist attention, but it no longer rewards it with anything new. If one stays with it anyway, what emerges is a sense of routine carried to its natural conclusion. The dynasty's defining act was not conquest or reform, but repetition. The same solutions applied again and again because they had worked before. Marriage to secure land, titles to secure loyalty, bureaucracy to secure order. Each layer reinforced the last, creating a structure that felt permanent precisely because it changed so little. For the people within that structure, this constancy shaped expectations. You knew roughly what your place was. You knew how authority behaved. You knew which doors mattered and which ones were decorative. The empire did not promise happiness or fairness. It promised predictability. And for a long time, that was enough. Predictability, however, has limits. It depends on the environment remaining cooperative. When the surrounding world began to reward speed, visibility, and participation, predictability lost some of its appeal. The Habsburg system continued to offer stability, but stability alone no longer answered the questions people were asking. This shift did not happen all at once. It crept in through small changes. Newspapers circulated faster than decrees. Public opinion formed before official responses arrived. Economies responded to markets rather than marriages. None of this directly opposed the dynasty. It simply operated alongside it, gradually drawing attention elsewhere. Within the imperial household, the rhythms remained unchanged. Schedules were kept, protocols observed. The language of authority stayed formal and careful. There was dignity in this consistency, but also a growing distance between form and effect. Decisions still carried weight, but less reach. Influence persisted, but more slowly. By the time the empire ended, much of its work had already been done by inertia. The final years were less about ruling than about concluding processes that had begun long before. Even the formal end felt procedural. Papers were signed, announcements made. Life reorganized itself without drama. What followed was not emptiness, but redistribution. Power did not vanish, it relocated. Responsibility did not disappear, it spread. The absence of a central dynasty made room for other systems to take hold. Some worked better, some did not. History did not pause to evaluate the exchange. For the Habsburg name, this meant a transition from instruction to reference. It no longer told anyone what to do. It explained why certain things existed, a background logic, rather than a command, the kind of presence that informs understanding without directing action. In this state, the dynasty becomes almost neutral. It is no longer a subject of loyalty or opposition. It is something you encounter when tracing causes, a layer beneath modern arrangements, a reminder that long systems leave long shadows, even after the source has faded. There is a gentle irony in this. A family so committed to continuity ends up continuous only as context. Their influence survives not through authority, but through explanation. They are remembered because they lasted, not because they ended dramatically. And perhaps that is why the story finally feels complete. There is nothing left unresolved, because resolution was never the point. The point was duration. And duration, eventually, concludes simply by stopping. No scene closes, no curtain falls. The narrative does not signal its own ending. It just ceases to add chapters. The last page looks much like the one before it, except quieter. If you linger here, there is no pressure to stay alert. The patterns repeat softly. The outcomes are known. The mind is free to loosen its grip on sequence and detail. History becomes texture rather than narrative. This is the final comfort of long stories. They ask nothing urgent from the listener. They allow attention to drift without consequence. Nothing important will be missed because everything important has already happened. So the Habsburgs remain where they belong now. Not in motion, not in command, but settled. Their centuries arranged neatly behind them, their influence dispersed, their work complete. There is no final lesson delivered out loud, no instruction issued at the end, only the quiet sense that a long process has reached rest. And in that rest, the story no longer needs to continue. It does not fade abruptly, it simply stays where it is, finished, calm, and quiet enough to let everything else go still as well. And now, at the very end, even the sense of closure becomes almost imperceptible. The Habsburgs, having existed for centuries as both family and system, exist now primarily as memory. Not dramatic memory, not a story that demands attention, but a quiet background of understanding, like the hum of a long-abandoned hall whose walls remember every footstep without announcing it. Their history no longer presses, it no longer seeks notice. There is no single moment that must be remembered. The marriages, the titles, the alliances, the inheritance of territories, all of it now folds into pattern. Repetition becomes the narrative. Continuity itself, once their strength, becomes the story. This is what allows it to soothe. There are no surprises, no peaks or sudden turns. A person could trace the arc from the first castle in Switzerland to the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire without feeling urgency, because urgency was never part of how the system functioned. The dynasty ruled not with spectacle, but with the persistent rhythm of procedure. And in the end, that same rhythm winds down quietly. Power, it seems, is not always loud. Influence is not always sharp. Stability maintained carefully, can last centuries and fade without fanfare. The Habsburgs demonstrate this perfectly. Their end arrives not with collapse, but with absence. Not with fireworks, but with a gentle slipping of relevance, leaving behind architecture, borders, and archives as silent witnesses. Even their most famous features, the jaw, the inbreeding, the repetitive ceremonies have softened into symbols rather than warnings. They are signposts of endurance, evidence that persistence itself can shape history, even when brilliance is rare and urgency ignored. For those who lived within the empire, life remained ordinary even as it was extraordinary. Taxes, crops, laws, and etiquette continued regardless of imperial whim. For those outside, the dynasty eventually became almost invisible, except in documents and maps. Influence had receded, but order persisted. The final generations learned a subtler lesson. Identity does not require authority. Names endure even when their power does not. Presence can exist as context, function as explanation, and still allow the world to move forward. And so, the narrative concludes the only way it ever could, slowly, without spectacle, without tension. The empire that lasted centuries ends not with a bang, but with the absence of need. The dynasty persists only as memory, stable, quiet, and complete. No last word needs to be spoken. No final event demands attention. The story itself has reached rest, finished, calm, and ready for sleep. And in this final quiet, the story fully exhales. Nothing more presses forward. The centuries of strategy, ceremony, and careful inheritance now exist only as memory. The empire does not linger in action, it lingers in understanding. Its rhythms, once relentless and procedural, have slowed to stillness. The Habsburgs taught, without insisting, that power can endure without drama. Their legacy is measured not in spectacle, but in persistence. Repetition maintained influence, continuity preserved authority, and when relevance eventually slipped away, it did so gently, leaving a calm record rather than a dramatic collapse. For those tracing the dynasty's arc, the lesson is subtle. Long systems conclude not in a burst, but in quiet disengagement. The machinery of rule winds down, the ceremonies fade, and the presence that once demanded attention becomes background. Nothing is destroyed, nothing is rushed. The empire simply ceases to be necessary. Even the most infamous traits, the inbreeding, the protruding jaw, the endless marriages have softened into symbols, reminders of how structure outlasts individuals. The family that once shaped Europe now shapes only memory, maps, and archives, waiting silently for the occasional glance. Time continues, unconcerned. The people who once followed Habsburg authority carry on with their lives. The empire's structures persist only in context, not in command. Authority has dispersed, influence has dissipated. The dynasty rests in the calm after function, in the stillness after centuries of repetition. And so, the long story concludes exactly as it began, slowly, quietly, without interruption. No single moment of climax, no sudden revelation, only a measured conclusion, allowing history to settle and minds to drift. The name remains, the buildings remain, the papers remain, the story rests, the world continues, and sleep finally arrives. And now, all that remains is pure stillness. The Habsburgs exist only as echoes of a long, methodical presence, names on pages, outlines on maps, corridors in palaces that once held rulers now long gone. There is no motion left to follow, no authority to enforce, no ceremony to observe. The empire has receded entirely into memory, and memory itself has softened into quiet. It is tempting to look for drama, for a moment that defines the end, but there is none. The dynasty's conclusion was not abrupt. It unfolded as a gentle tapering, a system gradually losing relevance as the world moved faster than habit could sustain. Nothing exploded, nothing snapped. Influence drained slowly, like water from a vessel left on the counter. The lessons embedded in this story are quiet too. Power can last centuries when carefully administered, even if brilliance is rare. Systems built for continuity endure far longer than those built for spectacle. And when relevance finally fades, it does so without fanfare, leaving traces rather than demands. Even the notorious features, the inbreeding, the Habsburg jaw, The endless internal marriages have become symbols rather than crises. They remind us that persistence comes with costs, but that longevity itself has a strange dignity. The family that once shaped continents now shapes only the pages of history books and the occasional museum exhibit. Everything that once required action now requires only recognition. The world continues without pause, indifferent to the dynasty's faded authority. Names linger, buildings remain, borders bear subtle marks of decisions made long ago. Documents sit archived, quietly testifying to centuries of repetition. In this quiet, there is completion, nothing left unresolved, nothing demanding attention. The long experiment of endurance, of measured repetition, has drawn to rest. The story's rhythm slows until it is almost imperceptible. And as the narrative finally settles, it mirrors the ultimate quiet, the one that allows the mind to drift, the one that invites release, the one that whispers, softly, that it is time to sleep. And so, at last, the history of the Habsburgs dissolves into nothing more than quiet traces. The corridors that once echoed with the steps of archdukes and administrators stand empty. Palaces retain their grandeur, but the hands that signed decrees are long gone. The empire has receded entirely into memory, into maps, into archives, where it waits without urgency or expectation. There is no dramatic finale, no fireworks, no shout marking the end. The system that persisted through centuries of careful marriages, titles, and bureaucratic procedure fades as slowly as it built itself. Influence does not collapse. It drifts away, leaving the world to continue without interference. Even the most notable traits, the Habsburg jaw, the tightly interwoven family lines, the cautious, deliberate approach to power, are now merely symbols. They serve as reminders that continuity can endure longer than brilliance, and that persistence eventually softens into stillness. The dynasty no longer commands, it only informs. For those who lived under the empire, life shifted gradually. Laws remained, taxes were collected, people adapted to new authorities, and for the Habsburgs themselves, identity persisted without function. The name remained, but the expectation no longer dictated behavior. They became custodians of memory rather than wielders of power. The lesson is quiet. Systems built for longevity do not end with spectacle. They taper. They persist in form even as function diminishes. They leave behind traces that shape understanding long after authority has dissipated. Now, the narrative itself has reached a similar state. The story is complete, yet it does not insist on attention. There is no unresolved tension, no dramatic conclusion, just a slow, measured fade into quiet. The empire rests. The dynasty rests. And in their stillness, the mind can finally rest too. Finished. Calm. Quiet enough to sleep,